really clear on what you are trying to say, I can promise you nobody else in the congregation is going to be clear. And so you need to have in your mind exactly what you're trying to say. I have, over the years, sometimes for fun, just given random surveys to church members after listening to a sermon of mine, and I asked them in a sentence, tell me, what was the sermon about? Give me the sermon in one sentence. And I was always shocked at what I would read and how different their one sermon sentence was from mine. And so I think it's just really important. Now, one thing that we do at Kettering that I try to do every week that I preach is I will post on my Twitter account kind of my main gist, what I want everybody to take home with them. And then I hashtag that Take Church Home. And so if you go to Twitter and go hashtag Take Church Home, you can get my last 4 sentences of the last many sermons that I've preached. People know they can go there. I don't think we get tons of traction on that. I don't think lots of people follow it, but I will put that in my outline, and I find that that is always the hardest part, to get my teaching in a tweet, 280 characters or less, to reduce the whole sermon to a tweet is a discipline that is just difficult to do. But again, I would argue extremely important. Thou shalt be clear, so that you know exactly what you're trying to say. We will express this same idea in different ways over the next few sessions. You know, Haddon Robinson talks about the one big idea. Other authors talk about the thesis statement. However you want to capture it, whatever's helpful to you, the point is you need to know what you're trying to communicate. Because if you're fuzzy, I can promise you everybody in the congregation is going to be equally or more fuzzy on it. So I remember years ago, I was a student missionary in Swaziland. So I lived in the southern part of Africa there for a year, and I would often preach on Sabbath mornings. And after the church service one week, many people were coming out of the church and making just the most, unusual comments. Things like they would say things like, "Well, it's about time somebody really hammered on women who wear jewelry," which was confusing to me because I said nothing about women wearing jewelry in the sermon. And then somebody else came out and said, I'm so thankful, that a pastor will finally just have the courage to talk about the sin of cheese. And it's like, I didn't really mention anything about a vegan diet or not eating cheese. And I had a friend who was very fluent in both Swahili and English, and he told me later, he said, yeah, your interpreter, the guy translating, was preaching a sermon that had nothing to do with what you were saying, absolutely nothing to do with it. He was preaching his own sermon, which then made sense of all of the comments that people made on their way out of church. And I've wondered since how many times my sermons get lost in translation without even a translator. That, and when I had people write in a sentence what my sermon was all about, I was reminded that it was like they were listening to a translator interpreting his own sermon and not interpreting anything I was saying. And so, I mean, it's just a very challenging thing to do anymore, given all of the distractions that are at the fingertips of pretty much everybody in your congregation. To communicate clearly is the goal. And it's not easy to do, and so thou shalt be clear. All right? Next one is thou shalt be practical. People need to know, how this applies in my life. From Brian Chattel's book called Christ-Centered Preaching, he says, the healthiest preaching does not assume listeners will automatically see how to apply God's truth to their lives. It supplies the application people need. If even the preacher cannot tell or has not bothered to determine how the sermon's truth relate to life, then people not only are unlikely to make the connection, but also will wonder why they bothered to listen. I remember one of my teachers in seminary said, don't preach what. People already know what they ought to do and what they ought not to do. Preach how. People really want to know, how do I get along with my colleagues, or how do I, rest in the assurance of salvation? How do I have a vibrant, robust relationship with Jesus? How do I bake bread when I get home? And how do I spend time with Jesus? And what does that look like? All of this, going back to the basic commandment, if you will, thou shalt be practical. So I try every week to give people a homework assignment, or to spell out for them in my tweet, this is how we go from here. And so, for example, I just completed a series called Strengthening Our Core. And there were 3 parts to that sermon series: gratitude, generosity, and grace. And we're saying, we want to strengthen the core of who we are as a church, and we want to be people of gratitude, the people that are thankful. And so, to that end, I said, you don't strengthen your core. If you look at any great athletes, who, any sport, pretty much they talk about strengthening the core, whether you're talking to basketball players or golfers or wrestlers or cyclists, any sport pretty much obsess over a strong core. And yet nobody drifts into a chiseled six-pack. Nobody just happens to get a strong core. And so, my appeal to the congregation was, look, if we really want gratitude, for example, to be at our core, it's not going to just happen. You don't just wake up with a six-pack. It happens by tedious, consistent, hard, core strengthening exercises most every day of the year. And then years down the line, you have a much stronger core. And so it's not enough to just preach a 25-minute sermon and say, okay, we want to be at our core people of gratitude. Well, I think you got to make it way more practical than that, and just not hope that it happens, because people aren't naturally usually grateful. And so I gave very specific exercises, and then said, here's what I want all of us to do. I want us to do these core strengthening exercises every day. I mean, it just doesn't get much more practical. And so one of the exercises, and I gave a bunch, but one of them, for example, was something that I have really fallen in love with in terms of just helping to strengthen your core of gratitude, is an app that I discovered called Happy Feed, F-E-E-D as in dog, Happy Feed. And basically you just mark 3 moments of joy each day. And so every day I go to that app and I write down 3 moments of joy. So last night before I go to bed, and there's all kinds of research behind this and studies that suggest when people reflect intentionally on things that they are grateful for, when they are intentional about strengthening that core of gratitude, they live longer, they make more money, they have happier marriages. I mean, just on and on. There are all kinds of studies that suggest this is a practice that will serve you well, and it will just improve the quality of your life on a number of different levels. And so last night, I pulled out my happy feet, as I always do, and so my last thoughts every night before I drift off to sleep are things that I'm grateful for. And so one of the things was I got to tour this amazing community, and we got to go to the lake, and it was just such a wonderful day, and that was just a moment of great joy, as was lunch yesterday with your university president here, and I just marked it down, and I was just grateful for the conversation, just things I'm thankful for. So in all of this, to say, you know, when you preach, make it that practical. And so, like in the sermon, I said, okay, right now, just download that app. It's free, and let's all do this. And I've got, you know, probably maybe hundreds of people now doing the app and telling me almost every day I go somewhere and run across a church member, and hey, got my happy feet. I've got a streak going on. It keeps track of streaks. And I think I've got 470 some days going now. So, you know, they'll tell me I've got 8 days going, and like your sermon was one of my happy feet moments of joy last week, whatever. So, anyway, good on that. Again, if you ever have, if anybody has a question or a comment, or want to get a break from just listening to my voice, you just raise your hand. If not, I will plow forward. All right, we're on number 9. We're getting to the finish line. Yay. Okay, thou shalt preach from experience. Again, from Brian Chappell's book. You must know grace to preach it. No matter how great your skill or accolades, you are unlikely to lead others closer to God if your heart does not reflect the continuing work of the Savior in your life. A testimony that reinforces the message of the gospel is not merely a matter of public conduct. It is a product of consistent, private meditation on the gospel that character daily requires. The necessity of grace in balanced preaching inevitably points both preacher and parishioner to the work of Christ as the only proper center of a sermon. And that proper center of the sermon, it's not something that you can read, you know, it doesn't come by reading about it in a book or whatever. I mean, we've got to live the gospel, that's the point. For our preaching to have any credibility, effectiveness, for it to really work, then you've got to experience the grace you're preaching about. You've got to experience, you've got to know the bread of life. You have to be eating of the bread of life, drinking of the living water every day, or else your sermons are going to fall flat. They just will. There is no way around this basic principle that, you know, we just need to live what it is we're trying to communicate. And we'll talk a lot in this seminar about nonverbal communication and so on, but we all know that a very high percentage, and there's different studies that suggest different numbers, 70, 80, 90%, whatever, of communication is nonverbal. And so to just say the gospel and to speak grace is one thing, but then when you actually live it, that's what gives sermons power. And that's what makes them life transforming for our people. So, any comments? Not? All right, let's go to the last one. Number 10, thou shalt saturate every sermon with the good news of the gospel. Every sermon must speak to the good news. Another way to think about this commandment is to just ask yourself, is this a positive message? And we're going to talk a little bit about that coming up. Just to keep your sermons positive. Jesus didn't preach shaming messages. He didn't, it was never guilt-ridden, but rather, the gospel is good news. And I think our congregations need to radiate and live that good news. And that good news needs to be evident in the sermons that we preach. That they ought to be positive, good news. That, we are redeemed, we are saved. And in that, is the gospel, is good news. So we'll work hard around our church at just cultivating this kind of a culture. And again, that gets back to preaching about, we want to be people of gratitude, of thankfulness, of good news, so that when one of our church members moves into a neighborhood, it's good news for everybody in the neighborhood, because this was kind of God's plan, that you are to be light wherever you are. This is the church, and we're getting ready at Kettering to unveil this major new kind of reframing of our mission and values and vision and so forth, all around this whole idea of the church. That we don't want to do church, we want to actually be church. And we want to erase from the minds of all of our members that church is a building, that church is a service on Saturday morning. No, you are church. I am church. Wherever I am, that is church. This was Christ's plan. Go into the dark neighborhood and be light. Be good news. So toward that end, again, we're trying to create that kind of a culture at Kettering where I get to serve. And again, a practical, kind of simple thing to work us toward, to help us to do these, strengthening the core of gratitude and good news and so on. Another specific assignment that I gave was that we are erasing from our nomenclature and language around our church of the whole notion is of I have to. I don't have to do anything, but rather we get to. And I got this from a story written by Kristen Armstrong, who decided she was going to run her first marathon. And she was going to do this in Sacramento, so she reconnected with an old high school coach who lived down in San Diego, probably, 6 hours or something south, kind of the south end of California. And she said, hey, would you sort of train me, mentor me, and prepare me to run my first marathon? So I'd be honored to do that. I said, we're going to have to do it over the phone because obviously we live far apart. She said, well, that'd be great. Well, then he would tell her, well, today you need to do a 12-mile run. Today you need to work on speed, so you need to go down to the track and do sprints. Today you got to do hill work. And she found herself through the whole training process waking up in the morning with this sort of heavy attitude of, today I got to go run hills. Today I have to do this or that. Well, just before she was to run her marathon, her coach from San Diego called and said, hey, I decided I'm going to come up there and I want to see you off at the starting line. Well, that'd be awesome. That's great. Thank you. Well, it had been decades since they had seen each other, and when she saw him at the start line of the Sacramento Marathon, she hardly recognized him. She had no idea. He was in a heavy, clunky wheelchair. She didn't even know he had ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And so this was quite the feat to get into a car and to travel all the way up north to Sacramento to see her off. And of course, when she saw him, she was kind of blown away by this and said, "Oh man, I'm so sorry, you didn't have to come up here." And she writes, he looked at me and said, "No, I don't have to do this. I get to do this." Since being diagnosed with this intense disease, it has changed my whole perspective. There is no more "I have to." No, I don't have to. Instead, I get to. I want to. I get to charge up the hill Christian nights. I get to wake up early and run. I get to hit the gym after work. I get to work on new writing project. I get to make dinner for my children. I get to clean my house. I get to take Luke to football, Grace to drama, Bella to choir. I get to help my neighbors while they are out of town. I get to make healthy choices for my next meal. Never is it "I have to," now it is "I get to." So that's the kind of thinking we want to cultivate in our churches. The good news is inherently positive. We don't have to do anything. We don't have to come to church. We're getting ready this year to launch an $8 million building project. And there's a lot of dread in my spirit thinking about all of the stuff we got to do and all the money we have to raise, but I just keep telling myself, I don't have to do this. I get to be a part of what God is building in our community. I get to do this. And so we actually had t-shirts printed up that say #I get to, except I discovered that when you design the phrase "I get to," it's very difficult to find a font that doesn't make it look like "I ghetto." So the shirts kind of look like we're walking around campus saying "I ghetto," but it's actually "I get to." It's just a reminder to be positive, to think not about what we have to do. You don't have to be in this seminar. You don't have to take class. You get to. We don't have to preach. We get to preach. It's a great honor to do this. So, okay, so that's the 10 Commandments. How about we take a few minutes for comments, questions, answers, anything like that.